Guys, today I want to work through a little bit on sections 1.7 and 1.9 in AP Gov, Federalism. This is one of my favorite sections of the unit based purely on the fact that by the nature of federalism, conflicts will occur. We're going to see through this short lesson really overall how states and national government work together or don't work together in good ways and effective ways so that laws can be passed and really we're cared for as citizens. So we'll get a couple real life examples closer to the end of this, but we'll download some vocab first. So your goals today, first and foremost, is to be able to explain how grants, both block and categorical, influence the relationships between Washington and the states. We'll talk about mandates when the government sets out strict norms or strict expectations for states and how they either support or don't support the states to pull those off. We'll be talking about the cases of immigration and gay marriage to demonstrate how the Supremacy Clause makes Washington win in a thumb war between it and the states. And last but not least, we'll look at venue shopping and the example of Mothers Against Drunk Driving to see what it looks like when a special interest group learns the different parts of federalism and uses that to its advantage. Now on the next slide, I've got for us just kind of a dumping ground of different vocab terms that we will be seeing. I would say by the end of this, double check and come back to this point in the video that you are comfortable with these different vocab terms. It looks like a lot, but they kind of flow together to tell the story of federalism, kind of in three parts. So when we talk federalism, we're talking about that division of powers between the federal and state governments. Now, we've seen before that the Constitution lays out certain enumerated powers that the federal government in Washington can do. Those enumerated powers, especially the ones for Congress, are written word for word. Now, of course, there's the elastic clause that allows them to kind of stretch that a little bit, but there's some stuff that's written word for word. Stuff that is also in the Constitution may be specified for the states, and these reserved powers are things that each state has the responsibility to carry out. And as time has evolved and life has evolved, that list of reserved powers has kind of grown as states respond to the changing world. One of the sets of powers that's really interesting to me personally are the concurrent powers. There are some powers that both Washington and the states can work together to pull off. An example is managing courts. There's the Supreme Court and big federal courts that are directed by Washington, but also there are local courts like traffic court in Grand Rapids. So watching, Washington and Michigan or Washington and Grand Rapids having to play nice is really interesting to watch, in my opinion. Now, typically, liberals are looking for more unitarian policies, that we're not really leaning on the states to expand those reserved powers, that Washington really is taking charge, taking the lead as to how we should operate as a government. Conservatives are looking more for the practice of devolution. And devolution, which has been kind of really in the forefront for the last 40 years or so, is the practice where we start to transfer some enumerated powers, I should say, some programs that the federal government is doing based on its enumerated powers, and kind of moving those back to the states. So if we think about the elastic clause allowing Congress to kind of stretch what it's allowed to do, conservatives want to see some of those things devolve. Like, yeah, you stretched, and you came up with this new program, cool, but we believe that states could do it better, is the perspective of the conservatives. There we go. So some examples of our enumerated and reserved powers, right? Enumerated stuff that goes to the federal government is obviously going to be military, right? You don't want to reserve the power of the military to the states. Could you imagine the military of Ohio, what that would look like? Total disaster. Social Security and Medicare, that's federal programs that manages money in a big bucket for all of us. Relationships with other countries, that's enumerated. But some of the stuff that's reserved for the states. Schools, that's reserved for the states. Police, firefighters, running local elections. There's no real need for Washington to be stepping into my local elections here in Kentwood for school board. That would be way too large of a government overstep. And so we like when our states really run their elections in their own way. That way the government stays small in that regard, especially conservatives like that. Now, when I talked about those concurrent powers earlier on, those things that are shared between the two levels of government, we can look at them via cake. And it looks like this is a weird metaphor that maybe isn't universally understood. This is realistically how political scientists talk about federalism in the concurrent powers, stuff that's shared by both. On the left, we have layer cake federalism, and its technical term is called dual federalism. That's technically the term, but I like to think of it using what most people call it, layer cake. That means that programs and authority are clearly divided among the national, state, and local governments. Education, for example, is mostly a layer cake situation. It is very clear that certain responsibilities are done at the district level, certain responsibilities are done at the state level, and certain responsibilities are done at the federal level. And it's mostly at the state level. Um, that's the big layer in that cake. The federal government layer for education is a very small layer of cake. It's mostly frosting. Now, on the right, we see marble cake federalism. This is when programs and authority are mixed among the national, state, and local governments. So this is where both the federal government and the state government, for example, um, develop court systems and manage court proceedings, that some cases may be tried at the state level or the federal level, and state authorities and federal authorities sometimes have to work together. I was on a federal grand jury for a year and a half of my life. I remember there were several times that cases involved um, someone who is accused of crimes or potentially going to be indicted for a crime, that the conversation would be, yeah, like part of this is being handled by the state and part of it's handled by the federal government. That's marble cake federalism, technically called cooperative federalism, but I like cake, so we'll stick with marble cake. Another way that the two can interact, federal government and state governments interact, is through money. Money talks, right? And the federal government, by being the largest boon of budget money out there, has the opportunity to give states grants. And most state governments, about a quarter of their money is not coming necessarily from local taxes, but from federal taxes, federal income taxes. So you, as a taxpayer, when you pay your income tax to the federal government, not all of it's going to Washington. A lot of it's coming back to your state, which is nice. Now, the federal government can do this in two ways. They can issue block grants, and these are very, very, very popular for government that is looking, or state governments that are looking at really shaking things up. A block grant is just a pool of money that comes down from Washington to say, yeah, here is your bucket of money. We're going to get you about $1 billion. Take this $1 billion and improve healthcare. What does that even mean, right? What does that even look like? Is Michigan, for example, our state, is that going to go to hospitals? Is that going to go to insurance premiums? Is that going to go to pharmaceuticals or pharmacies? Like, what does that even mean? It's a big block chunk of cash, and that gives states flexibility. But if the grant isn't coming with too many rules, if the government isn't really laying out specifics, who knows how that money is going to get spent? So block grants are a risk, but if a state has a very clear vision for them, they can be super useful tools. Now, if the federal government wants to limit how a state uses its cash, categorical grants are the way to go. This is funding from the federal government with specific purposes in mind. A good example is education funding from the federal government. Most of school money comes from the state level. Most of it comes from state income, sales, and property taxes. However, there are certain chunks of money that come to school districts from Washington based on their ability to demonstrate, X, Y, and Z. And so, for instance, in the example of school districts in Michigan, if school districts can demonstrate that their students are performing at certain levels and in certain ways, particularly in reading, writing, and math, federal government will cut them a check specifically for reading programs. And maybe they'll say, yeah, here is your categorical grant for reading programs in school districts. You may only spend this cash if it clearly has to do with teaching kids how to read better. A block grant, the government might just say, hey, here's a check. Go make schools better, whatever that means. And a categorical grant will be like, here's a check. Spend this money on this purpose. And reading was my example. Now, it's hard to estimate how much a categorical grant should be for. The federal government often will cut either too big or too small of checks to state governments, and that's a risk. If the government says, yeah, let's send $123 billion to Michigan to improve reading among students. Okay, well, what if the teacher collective of Michigan discovers that we can teach reading way better and it's going to take about 165 million? Well, we're going to spend our 123 million, and then what do we do? Do we do a crappy job on the shortcoming, or do we have to fund that from school districts? So categorical grants have a paper trail, which is really nice. It's not like a mystery where is the money going, but sometimes it's not the right amount, and that can be a pickle. So why does this whole system of the federal government really work? And it works better in some years than in others. First and foremost, this is one that's just kind of superficial. And decentralizing political conflict. Instead of having all the tension and all of the conflict over politics being in Washington, we can spread it around into different areas so that conversations can be more specific to us. We as Michiganders don't necessarily need to get sucked into the drama of Texas or Washington or, God forbid, Ohio, right? And so this allows for some of these conversations to be spread out nationally. The flexible division of power. Federal and state governments can collaborate in claiming different responsibilities. No one really wants to call shotgun on a responsibility, but it does make sense that the federal government does certain things and state governments do certain things. The third big benefit of federalism is the offer of multiple access points. That if you need to connect with your government as an individual or maybe as a special interest group, you can look around and see the different limbs of the government at the national, state, and maybe even local city level to provide you a way to make change or start a conversation. If you're actively seeking out which access point you're going to latch onto, that's called venue shopping. So it's, a group might start a conversation with, a state's federal senators, some state senators, some representatives, some mayors of some cities, a governor, might have some conversations with all of them, look at all of the results of those conversations and say, yeah, our access point should be the governor. We should work with the governor's office versus maybe Washington. So venue shopping is kind of a perk. You can find out who can move your beliefs quicker. Last but not least is experimentation. Sometimes we call this a sandbox. We try new stuff in America. It's an experiment. This country's never been tried before. And so when we try new programs, the federal and state governments often will discover that they need to hand something off to the other because the other can do it better. And so if our national and our state governments are actually collaborating as friends, then they should be moving programs back and forth to each other to make sure that programs that serve us have the best results with the lowest costs if they want to work collaboratively. Some drawbacks of the system, though, inequalities of power, right? Because when we talk about the federal government and its role as the supreme power can decide what it does from day to day, well, in some governments, we will have a federal government not carrying its weight. Sometimes we'll have a federal government doing too much. One of the big issues with federalism is states having unequal success with their federalism. A good example of that is programs that provide meals to students in like the 3, 4, 5-year-old age bracket prior to getting to school. The federal government offers categorical grants to feed young children who are in maybe preschool or Head Start programs, and they give these categorical programs or grants to all states. Every state has a certain number of dollars per certain number of kids. But what happens if Pennsylvania is really, really good at making sure that money goes to getting these kids fed, and Idaho doesn't do a good job with that money? So the fact that we're using devolution to put this stuff on the hands of states and giving them the money to run it, cool, that gives you local control. But what if you do a worse job at it than a state nearby, right? So that is a big concern of federalism. Some of the drawbacks that come into play when we see conflicts usually always come through on mandates. Mandates are any sort of law or executive order that happens in Washington that provides new expectations for states to carry out. So a good example of this is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Not many years ago in our history, we didn't have any protections for people who have physical disabilities in getting to public spaces. There was no restriction or no norms on how wide a door should be for people who need wheelchairs, no supports for the blind, no supports for the hard of hearing. That companies could just do it if they wanted to, but there was no requirement. When the ADA came through and required public spaces, doors need to be 30 inches wide, and room labels need to have Braille on them, like different norms to support people with disabilities. The government passed those to help people with disabilities, and that was great, but it was an unfunded mandate. The federal government did not provide, with these new rules, any additional funding to actually pull this off. But the Congress at the time was a very small government Congress, so they really were just like, yeah, we'll go as far as saying you've got to do this, but you're on your own to pay for it. So there were a lot of expenses in transforming buildings to being compliant for people with disabilities. And unfunded mandates will cause tension, right? Thanks for the new rules, federal government. Now we got to pay for it as states. That's a huge, huge, huge conflict, right? Another example recently is the SAT, right? The federal government requires that we be testing our juniors nationwide with some sort of level test, but they don't provide much, if any at all, funding to actually pay for the SAT. That comes out of Michigan's budget, even though it was Washington's decision. Another mandate study is the Affordable Care Act. When we look at a funded mandate, these are things that the federal government says this must now be happening, this must now happen, and here are the funds to pull it off. So the Affordable Care Act in 2012 went by the name Obamacare. It was a funded mandate. Basically, the federal government would distribute money to the states to pay part of healthcare plans for those who couldn't afford healthcare. That's bringing down the cost and making sure that all Americans could have healthcare. The goal of the Affordable Care Act was kind of a trade-off. The idea would be that the federal government would start to send money in the direction of these healthcare provider companies to be able to handle the increased demand and increased number of people in their pool, in their healthcare pool. But also by giving them that cash and giving them that support, the federal government required that healthcare providers would have to take all Americans, regardless of if they had an pre-existing condition or if they were a youth. So prior to the Affordable Care Act, if you were someone who previously had had cancer and you needed to find a new healthcare system, a new healthcare program, you would often have a huge fee. It would cost you astronomical because you were a risk. Well, you can't choose when you get cancer. So the idea of the Affordable Care Act was, the federal government will add some money into the pools of these companies, support the businesses, and make sure that they can then support the people even if they're at risk. Or another example is if you were 18 years old and you, when you turn 18 and you move out of your parents' house, you used to lose your health care immediately. And most 18-year-olds aren't finding jobs that come with health care. So you would have college-age students for years and years have no health insurance. So another one of the mandates from the Affordable Care Act was that kids could, after turning 18, could continue on their parents' healthcare plan up through 26, when it's reasonable that they would have a job then, that they would be offered healthcare, at least more likely. The controversy of it, though, was that even though it would increase incomes to these corporations, these businesses, these restrictions on these businesses rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. That even though it was a funded mandate, some of the rules that came with the funded mandate really bothered some people in Congress. So some of the protections were stripped away, and it kind of ended up becoming more of an expensive thing than it needed to be, just in the whole conflict over what rules can we put on these businesses. I put in here my personal thought. I think if the thing had gone through as it was, it would have been cheaper than what's happening now. But when Congress gets a hold of something and debates it, then it can get a little messy, right? So let's take a look at our last few case studies here to wrap this up. The federal government has at all times supremacy. Article 6 of the Constitution provides for the supremacy of the federal government over the states anytime there's an issue or a conflict between them. The most famous example of the U.S. government pulling the supremacy card against a state was the 1819 case, McCulloch v. Maryland. So early on in our history, we didn't really have like a national bank or any sort of like way to manage American dollars. We were a young country, just gotten out of the War of 1812, and things were just kind of messy. And the federal government started to put together a system to manage money and credit and equity and bank stuff for all Americans as a national bank. The state of Maryland looked at that and said, nah, we can do it better as Maryland. We're going to start the Bank of the State, Maryland. And the federal government, the Secretary of State of Treasury, McCulloch, sues Maryland and says, no, we already got a bank. You can't have a competing bank with us. The Supremacy Clause says that our bank really wins out over your bank. And ultimately, after a couple of different appeals, McCulloch wins. The federal government has that power over the state. The federal government has already established a bank for all Americans. So it's Maryland stepping on the toes of the federal government. It's Maryland violating supremacy and can't be upheld. So with McCulloch v. Maryland, the federal government asserted its power, asserted its strength over the states. Let's take a look at some more federalism case studies. The situation of gay marriage has evolved very rapidly, and really in an 8-year period, our country was completely turned over on its head in terms of access to marriage for people in the LGBTQ community. In 1994, in order to kind of get himself a little more conservative support, liberal President Bill Clinton passes the Defense of Marriage Act, stating that no federal law could be passed about marriage being allowed between same-sex couples, basically putting a wall up that anything Washington does must preserve the idea of marriage being between one man and one woman. Now, since that became a federal thing, that actually allowed for states to do it. It basically said, hey, we as federal government, we're not going to touch it. So we will reserve the power of coming up with your rules on marriage to the states. And that's an example of devolution that the Republicans were a huge fan of. They wanted states' rights, and here was a Democratic president who gave them states' rights. And so it caused a bit of a conflict, though, because, well, check it out here. It says federalism conflict. Even though the states could offer gay marriage, states were not observing the full faith and credit clause. That's that clause that means that you must respect the rules of other states, even if they're different from yours, even if the person comes from Ohio, right? And so an example would be a couple married in Massachusetts, potentially. If they moved to Texas, Texas had no obligation to treat them as a married couple. They would treat them as single for tax purposes, for inheritance purposes, for property purposes, at most would ever treat them like roommates. And so in 2003, a woman named Edie Windsor, after her wife died and left her assets, went after this idea of the federal government and the Defense of Marriage Act not actually working if you do allow states to come up with their own gay marriage rules. The conservatives in the United States were overjoyed that they had gained more power for the states. That's a huge win for them. But Edie Windsor successfully was able to show that she was able to show in court that fine, whatever, states can do whatever. But when Edie's wife died and left her bank account and her assets as part of her will, because that's typically what spouses do, be awkward otherwise. When Edie Windsor's wife dies, the federal government taxed all of those assets as though they weren't wife and wife, but roommate and roommate. And inheritance to a non-spouse person or a non-child involves a huge tax thing. So, nowadays, if you die and you leave everything to your spouse, if you have a spouse, that's taxed minimally. If you die single legally and with no children, then wherever the money goes is taxed heavily. Edie Windsor says, well, we're married in this state. So why are you taxing us like we're not married? Even though she has died now, when I inherit as her wife, her assets, I'm being unfairly taxed. And so successfully, it was overturned. The Defense of Marriage Act was overturned because the Supreme Court found that even though it was a win for states' rights, when it came time to taxes, the federal government was not able to respect that. And the federal government wasn't about to change tax code because that's a nightmare. In Obergefell v. Hodge, then, now that Defense of Marriage Act is over, and there's the possibility that the federal government could establish gay marriage nationwide, in Obergefell v. Hodge, the court found that the inequalities that were occurring from state to state in marriages and the inequality between how companies were treating their gay married employees versus their straight married employees when it comes down to like healthcare and providing healthcare to families was uneven. That if you were hoping, if you were someone who was gay and married, you were hoping that your employer would treat your spouse like your spouse. But if the employer didn't believe in gay marriage, they could choose to just not extend healthcare to your spouse like is normal. So in Obergefell, then basically it overturned all state protections for a prohibition on gay marriage, basically saying no state can make any rules prohibiting gay marriage and no company can produce any sort of rules or documentation discriminating against gay couples who are married. And they use the 14th Amendment, equal protection. So here's an example of federalism happening in favor of the states and then swooping back in favor of the federal government. So it evolves a lot. Kind of a shorter case study is immigration here with the case of U.S. v. Arizona, ultimately Arizona v. U.S. In 2012, Arizona had a Republican governor, and a huge platform at the time and kind of still today was immigration. That Republican Arizonans were saying, hey, we want to beef up our protection of our borders. And so we want to allow state and local cops to do the same illegal immigration busting activities as federal agents. Their point was, what they said was, we're not getting the support we need, and people are coming through the border. But what was actually happening once they passed this law is that the state and local cops in Arizona started to just kind of pull over anyone and just would say, hey, show me your documentation. Are you illegal? And they would pull over people who were like born in Arizona and lived there for like 50 years. But if they didn't have their driver's license by accident, you accidentally leave your house, then they could say, okay, well, we have to take you in and until we can show that you are here legally. And so it kind of went way overboard. And so the federal government sued Arizona, saying, Arizona, you're stepping on our toes. It is an enumerated power that immigration be controlled by um, by the federal government. That's our job. That's why we have Customs and Border Control. That's why we have Immigration, Customs services and officers. And Arizona appealed, said, no, 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 no. We aren't getting what we need down here. And so when Arizona sued back against the U.S. to really still want to do this, the Supreme Court sided with the United States in supremacy, obviously because the federal government already had the power. But they also found that Arizona, because it didn't have the support that federal agents do in making sure that there's equal protection and people are treated fairly when they're pulled over as suspected immigrants, there were so many people that were being treated unfairly for suspicion. Like you would find college kids who would be driving, hand-me-down cars that were low quality, and they would get pulled over and arrested for not being able to show that they're legally allowed to be here, even though the cop had just kind of profiled and said, well, you have a crappy car, so you might be an immigrant who is of low resources. And realistically, at the end of the day, Arizona couldn't prove that they actually, by allowing cops to pull over people suspected of being illegal immigrants, were catching any more illegal immigrants. It was just discrimination. So that was that case where the federal government won again. Our last case study of federalism is MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving in the 80s. This one isn't so much a federal government and state government interacting between each other, but it's more so a individuals and special interest groups interacting with the different levels of government. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers in the 80s mounted a massive campaign, and especially in the 90s, I remember it, really pushing to make sure that drunk driving would reduce. Drunk driving is still a big issue in the United States, but it used to be a huge issue, way beyond what you can imagine now. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers worked with the federal government, pushing for categorical grants to allow for states to increase restrictions on drunk driving, on breathalyzers, etc., like categorical grants. The government would then send money to the states saying this is money specifically to be spent on reducing drunk driving. This is how it will be spent, categorical grant. But they also worked with state governments to lobby for laws on legal blood alcohol levels. Blood alcohol levels in your bloodstream in most states, you could drive if you were at 0.1 percent blood alcohol level, which is still it's pretty risky. Some people are convinced they can drive at that level, but they shouldn't. But Mothers Against Drunk Driving drivers lobbied successfully to get in states that had that level, like Michigan, 0.1, to lower it and say, no, 0.08% blood alcohol level is actually the upper limit. You go over that, you get arrested. So by seeking out their connections at all different levels, working with the federal government and the state government, you can see MAD did some venue shopping and tried to work the different levels of the government to their advantage. So just as a reminder, in this presentation, you guys got to see a couple of different learning objectives here and some vocab. So you guys got to see a little bit about how block and categorical grants can really impact the relationship between federal and state governments. You were able to see how mandates kind of create tension between federal and state governments and how annoying it is for states when the federal government gives an unfunded mandate. You saw the cases of immigration and gay marriage to see how supremacy and the Constitution win when there is a conflict between the states. And you saw our state and federal government. You also saw that case of McCulloch v. Maryland on the banks. Even when it comes down to money, federal government wins. Last but not least, you guys saw the example of MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, showing that you can hop from different levels of the government to achieve different goals. That's venue shopping.